October 12th, 2009 was a Sunday. In Charlotte, North Carolina, Renata Bowen had been awake since 5 a.m. Not from worry she was not yet in the part of her life that produced that kind of wakefulness, but because Sunday was the one morning she had the apartment to herself. Her daughters, Simone and Destiny, slept like the dead on weekends, and Renata had learned to guard the hours before they woke the way other people guarded money. She made coffee. Dark roast, the specific brand she had been buying since nursing school, when she discovered it was the only thing that reliably got her through the night shift transition. She sat at the kitchen table. She read 3 pages of the novel she had been trying to finish for 6 weeks. She was 31 years old, a licensed practical nurse who worked the overnight shift at Carolinas Medical Center 4 nights a week, and Sunday mornings were the one space in her week that belonged entirely to her. She had driven the girls to her mother's house in Columbia the previous Friday, a 2-hour drive south on I-77. The girls in the back seat bickering pleasantly over a shared pair of earbuds, the October light coming through the windows in the warm way it did before it went cold. Her mother, Vivienne Bowen, had been asking for a visit for months. Her back was bothering her. She wanted to see the girls. Renata had agreed to drop them for the weekend and pick them up Monday morning before school. She had kissed them both goodbye at Vivienne's front door on Friday afternoon, told Simone to look after her sister, told Destiny not to eat all the candy before dinner, and driven back to Charlotte to sleep before her night shift. She was supposed to pick them up Monday. She would not see them again for 15 years. What happened between Sunday morning and Monday afternoon, between Renata sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee and her novel, and the moment she knocked on her mother's front door and got no answer, is the beginning of a story that does not have a clean explanation even now. The house in Columbia was empty. Not abandoned, not ransacked. Cleaned. The girls' overnight bags were gone. The spare toothbrushes Vivienne kept for them were gone. The photograph that had sat on the mantelpiece, Simone and Destiny, at ages 5 and 3, in Easter dresses, grinning at the camera, was gone. The house looked like someone had made a decision and executed it carefully, without leaving anything behind that could serve as a thread. Vivienne Bowen was gone too. Renata called the Columbia Police Department from the front porch at 2:17 p.m. On Monday, October 13th, 2009, she told them her daughters were missing. She told them her mother had taken them. The officer who took the initial report asked several questions that Renata would later describe as the first time she understood that the system and her situation were not going to fit together the way she needed them to. Had there been a custody dispute? No, Renata was the girl's sole legal guardian. Their father had not been in the picture for 3 years, and there was no legal arrangement of any kind that would explain or authorize what had happened. Had she and her mother argued recently? They had, but nothing that the officer made a note. Was it possible the girls had gone somewhere voluntarily? They were 9 and 6. 3 days passed. Then a week. Then the investigation, such as it was, produced a lead. Vivienne Bowen's car had been spotted at a gas station in Spartanburg, South Carolina, approximately 70 miles from Columbia, on Monday afternoon. One day after the girls were gone, the footage was grainy. Vivienne was visible at the pump. The back seat of the car was not clearly visible. The lead was logged, and the investigation continued, slowly. The way investigations move when the case involves a grandmother and grandchildren rather than a stranger and a child. When the family relationship creates ambiguity that investigators are not always trained to cut through cleanly. The case was formally classified as a family abduction in November 2009. This designation was accurate and useless simultaneously. It accurately described what had happened. It also placed the case in a category that, in practice, received less urgency than stranger abduction cases. Because the working assumption behind the classification was that the children were physically safe with a family member, even if that family member had taken them without authorization. even if their mother had been given no information about where they were or how they were. Renata Bowen was given a case number and a detective's phone number and the information that the investigation was ongoing. The investigation was not, in any meaningful sense, ongoing. Renata Bowen had grown up in Colombia, the younger of two daughters, in a house where emotional temperature was managed by proximity and avoidance rather than by conversation. Her mother, Vivienne, was a woman of firm opinions and modest demonstration of them. She expressed what she thought through action rather than statement. Through the particular persistence of someone who believed their position was correct and was waiting for the other person to recognize this. Renata had understood this about her mother since adolescence. She had accommodated it, navigated around it, and occasionally collided with it in the way that adult daughters collide with mothers they love and do not always agree with. The opinions about the girls, about the neighborhood in Charlotte, about the work schedule, about the sitter, were of a kind with a dozen other opinions Vivienne had expressed across Renata's adult life. Renata had heard them, had not always accepted them, had managed the relationship with the careful maintenance of someone who understood that her mother's love and her mother's judgment were both real and were not always pointing in the same direction. What Renata had not known what she would spend 15 years slowly and incompletely reconstructing was how far her mother was willing to go to act on those opinions. Renata herself was a woman who had built her professional life on the ability to function under pressure. She had started her LPN certification program at 22 while working at a deli counter 6 days a week, had completed it while pregnant with Simone, and had passed her licensing exam 3 months after Simone was born. She had done this alone, without family support, without the financial cushion that made such things easier for some people. And she had done it with the particular determination of someone who understood that the alternative to functioning was not an option she could afford. Her colleagues at Carolinas Medical Center described her as the person you wanted beside you on a difficult shift, not because she was the most experienced, but because she was the clearest, the one who identified what needed to happen next, and said it plainly when others were managing competing priorities. She had a stillness in difficult moments that nurses and doctors relied on. A stillness that her patients' families described simply as, "She made us feel like someone was in charge." She had raised her daughters the same way, with structure and steadiness and a quality of presence that the girls had learned to navigate the particular presence of a mother who was there fully when she was home and was absent when she was working, in the way that the absence was part of the schedule, not a gap in the commitment. Simone had adapted to this with the pragmatism of her first child, organized and self-sufficient in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes lonely. Destiny had adapted differently, more interior, more drawing, filling the hours with images the way other children filled them with noise. The family was not wealthy and not struggling. They were in the particular middle of American life, employed and housed and able to pay for what they needed, without enough left over to absorb an emergency without feeling it. They were fine, in the specific way that fine means functional and not much more. They were loved. This last thing was the most true and the most important, and was, in the end, the thing that survived everything that came after. Renata herself was a woman who had built her professional life on the ability to function under pressure. She had started her nursing certification program at 22 while working at a deli counter 6 days a week, had completed it while pregnant with Simone, and had passed the licensing exam 3 months after Simone was born. Her colleagues at Carolinas Medical Center described her as the person you wanted beside you on a difficult shift, not because she was the most experienced, but because she was the clearest, the one who could identify what needed to happen next and say it plainly when everyone else was managing competing priorities. She had a specific quality of stillness in difficult moments that other nurses and doctors noticed and relied on, a quality that her patients' families often described simply as, "She made us feel like someone was in charge." Her daughters had come by their personalities in the ways that children do, inheriting some things and inventing others. Simone at 9 was her mother's daughter in the directness, in the way she stated her position and expected it to be heard. She was tall for her age, already reading at a level that made her fourth-grade teacher's assessments stretch for adequate language, and she had inherited from some earlier generation a habit of tilting her head slightly left when she was concentrating, a gesture so characteristic that several of her teachers at the time of her disappearance mentioned it specifically to investigators, as if it were something that would help identify her, something you would recognize if you saw her. Destiny at 6 was different, quieter, more interior, a child who observed before she spoke and who had developed, by the age of 6, an eye for the visual world that expressed itself in the drawings she covered every piece of paper she could find with. She drew everything. Her teachers that year had noted it as exceptional focus for a kindergartner. The family lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Eastway Drive corridor of Charlotte. The neighborhood was not wealthy and not dangerous. It was the particular middle of American city life, functional and unremarkable, full of families managing with what they had and doing it without drama. Their downstairs neighbor, a woman named Mrs. Elise Curry, who had retired from 30 years of postal service, watched the girls on the 3 afternoons a week when Renata's shift ran long. She described Simone and Destiny to investigators in the months after the disappearance as the best-behaved children she had ever babysat, by which she meant not that they were passive or quiet, but that they were secure in themselves, unhurried, the children of a woman who had given them what they needed to be themselves. The trip to Colombia on October 9, 2009, had been unremarkable in every way until it wasn't. Renata had packed the girls' bags on Thursday evening, made sure Simone had her library book and Destiny had her drawing supplies, a specific requirement. Since Destiny without paper and pencils was Destiny at reduced capacity and had driven south on a Friday morning with the easy confidence of someone doing something routine. She had done this drive dozens of times. She had left her daughters with her mother before and picked them up again. There was no reason to believe this time would be any different. The last thing she said to them, standing in Vivienne's doorway, was what she always said: "Be good. Listen to Grandma. I'll see you Monday." Simone had hugged her with the brief efficiency of a 9-year-old with better things to do. Destiny had held on longer, the way she often did, and Renata had kissed the top of her head and untangled herself gently and walked back to the car. She had waved from the driveway. They had waved back from the porch. She had turned onto the street and pointed north and driven home. She was supposed to pick them up Monday. She would not see them again for 15 years. On Monday morning, Renata drove south on I-77 as she had driven it Friday, arriving at her mother's house in Columbia at just past 11 a.m. She knocked. No answer. She had a key, but the door was already locked from the inside, the first wrong thing. She went around back. The yard was empty. She looked through the kitchen window at a kitchen that had been cleared, not cleaned after a weekend cleared, but emptied and wiped down. The kind of clearing that is a decision rather than a routine. She called her mother's cell. It went directly to voicemail. Her mother never turned her phone off. She called the Columbia Police Department from the front porch at 2:17 p.m. She told them her daughters were missing. She told them her mother had taken them. The officer who responded asked whether there had been a custody dispute. No. Had she and her mother argued recently? They had, but the officer made a note. Was it possible the girls had gone somewhere voluntarily? They were 9 and 6. 3 days passed. Then a week. Then the investigation produced the only concrete lead it would ever generate. A gas station security camera in Spartanburg had captured Vivienne's dark blue Chevrolet Impala on Monday afternoon, 70 miles northwest of Columbia. Vivienne was visible at the pump. The back seat was not clearly visible. The lead was logged, and the investigation continued in the technical sense that it remained open and generated occasional paperwork, and in no practical sense at all. The case was classified as a family abduction in November 2009. This designation was accurate and useless simultaneously. It accurately described what had happened. It also placed the girls in a category that the system treated with reduced urgency, on the operating assumption that children with a family member were physically safe, even if their presence was unauthorized. Renata Bowen was given a case number and a phone number and the information that the investigation was ongoing. The investigation was not, in any meaningful sense, ongoing. What the system could not do for her, she did for herself. She maintained a tip line through a website she built in early 2010, updated it every time she had new information or new age progression photographs, called the detective every month and then every 2 months, and then whenever something came up that felt worth reporting. She drove to Spartanburg and Greenville and a dozen small towns across the upstate over the following years, following the faint intelligence of Cheryl Dawson's secondhand tip. She distributed flyers at churches and community centers and wherever people gathered who might have seen a woman arrive in a new place with 2 young girls. She documented everything. She kept records the way she kept her nursing notes precise, dated, cross-referenced, each entry a small act of insistence that this was not over. She thought about Simone's voice every day. Not her face, she had photographs for that. The voice. The specific way Simone said her name when she needed something. The particular emphasis on the second syllable that meant she was about to ask for something she expected to be told no about. She thought about Destiny's habit of sleeping with one arm completely outside the blanket, no matter the temperature. A habit that had produced dozens of small negotiations and that Renata would find herself, at unexpected moments across 15 years, reaching to tuck in an arm that wasn't there. These were not the kinds of things that transferred to a flyer or a tip line or a database. They were the things that made the search personal in a way that no official case number could contain. The first year was exhausting in the way first years of grief are exhausting. The administrative load of it, the calls, the forms, the follow-ups, the maintenance of a search the official system had effectively discontinued. She applied for a transfer at work, closer to Columbia, was denied, applied again, was approved, and moved to a smaller apartment in Rock Hill, South Carolina, 30 miles from where her mother's house had sat empty before a neighbor's report and a landlord's reclamation had cleared it out. The house yielded nothing. The neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had lived next door to Vivienne for 11 years, told Renata she had noticed the girls arriving Friday and had not noticed anything unusual that weekend. No arguments, no activity that suggested what was coming. What happened next changed everything, or rather, what happened next changed the direction of everything, slowly, over years, without the dramatic velocity that the phrase suggests. A thread appeared in 2011. A woman named Cheryl Dawson, who had worked with Vivienne at a dry cleaning business in the late 1990s, contacted Renata's tip line to say she had heard, secondhand, that Vivienne had moved to the upstate Greenville or Spartanburg. No address, no number. Secondhand information at the precise level of specificity needed to suggest direction without providing destination. Renata drove to Greenville, then Spartanburg, then Duncan and Simpsonville, and a dozen small towns across the upstate on weekends over the following 2 years, going to church services and community gatherings and the kinds of places where a woman who had arrived recently with 2 young girls might have been noticed. She found nothing solid. The thread was real. She was certain of this in the way people are certain about things they cannot prove, but she could not find where it attached. 3 years passed, then 5, then 7. She joined a support group for parents of missing children in 2014, 5 years after Destiny and Simone disappeared. The group met in a church basement in Charlotte, 12 people around folding tables. coffee in styrofoam cups, the community that forms among people who share a catastrophe that most other people cannot imagine. Renata became, in the way that people with competence and duration sometimes become in those groups, a stabilizing presence for those newer to the experience. She was not wise about it. She was simply further along and willing to say what further along looked like from the inside. She told people, "You will learn to carry it. Not that it gets lighter, that you get stronger. There is a difference." She continued anyway. In 2015, 6 years after the girls disappeared, a volunteer forensic artist generated age progression images, what Simone and Destiny might look like at 18 and 15, at 20 and 17, at 24 and 21. The images were careful and technically accomplished, and Renata looked at them for a long time when they arrived and felt something she did not have a word for: the specific experience of seeing your child's face rendered by someone who has never seen your child, assembled from statistical probability and genetic estimation rather than memory. The face on the image was possible. It was not Simone. It was not Destiny. It was a placeholder for them in the world of official records, which was useful and inadequate simultaneously. She updated the flyers with the new images. She circulated them. She received calls from people who thought they'd seen someone. She followed every call. None led anywhere real. The first year Destiny would have turned 13. Renata sat in her car in the parking lot of a Target in Rock Hill for 40 minutes before she could go inside. She had been buying school supplies on the first weekend of August for as long as she could remember, first for herself and then for her girls. And she sat in the parking lot that year with a list she had written out of habit notebooks, pencils, a specific kind of folder that Simone had preferred and could not make herself go in. She stayed until the impulse passed, and then she drove home, and she did not write the list again the following year. By 2019, 10 years in, she had made peace with the possibility that she might not find them in her lifetime. Not resignation, she had not stopped searching, had not updated the website's last entry from active to archived, had not told the detective to stop calling her with nothing, but a kind of accommodation to the fact that the search had become the condition of her life rather than a temporary state, that this was what she did now, that the question would remain open until it was answered, and that the answer might come and might not, and that she was going to keep looking either way. She did not know, across all those years, that the answer she was looking for was being drawn in a middle school art class 50 miles south of where she lived. She didn't know it yet, but something her daughter kept putting on paper would eventually reach the person who knew how to read it. Destiny had been drawing her mother's face since she was old enough to hold a pencil with intention. She had drawn it in sketchbooks and on the backs of homework assignments and on the margins of notebooks through middle school and into high school. Always the same face, always the same tilt of the head to the left, always the same quality in the eyes that her art teacher would eventually recognize as the specific quality of something drawn from deep memory rather than imagination. The drawing was not a conscious act. It was the body doing what the body does when it remembers something the mind cannot reach, returning to it, circling it, refusing to let it go entirely, keeping the record in the only medium available. Janelle Okafor was 29 years old in the spring of 2024 and had been teaching middle school art in Greenville, South Carolina for 4 years. She had grown up in Greenville, studied fine arts at Winthrop University in Rock Hill, and had returned to teach because the school where she'd done her student teaching had offered her a job when she finished her degree, and because Greenville was home, and home had its pull, and some things are simpler than we make them. She was good at her job in the specific way that teachers who actually see their students are good at it, not just at techniques and standards, but at the noticing. The thing that had drawn her to teaching in the first place was what she described, when she thought about it carefully, as the art of paying attention. She paid attention to the work. She paid attention to the people making it. She paid attention to the gap between the two, which was where the most important information usually lived. She had 32 students in her 8th grade class. She knew them in the ways that middle school teachers know their students through the texture of the year, through 100 small observations accumulated over months of watching them work. She knew who needed encouragement and who needed challenge. She knew who used art as performance and who used it as processing. She knew which students were in it for the grade and which students would have been drawing anyway, regardless of any class. Because making images was how they thought. Destiny was in the second category. Janelle had recognized this in the first week of school, when most students were still figuring out how to hold the charcoal, and Destiny was already producing marks on the page that suggested she had been living inside a relationship with drawing for years. She was quiet in class, not withdrawn, but interior. The kind of student who worked intensely and said little, who let the work speak and kept everything else private. Janelle had respected this. She had not pushed. Some students needed space more than they needed guidance, and she had learned to read the difference. In March 2024, reviewing portfolios for the spring showcase, Janelle pulled Destiny's folder and found 12 drawings completed across the year. The first time through, she noted the technical development, the improvement in how Destiny was handling light and shadow across the months, the increasing confidence in her line work, the way her compositions had become more sophisticated in the second semester. The second time through, she noticed something else. 7 of the 12 drawings contained the same woman's face. Not as the subject. Never as the explicit subject. The woman appeared in a corner of a street scene, in the background of what appeared to be a kitchen interior, as a face in a crowd at what might have been a bus station. In one drawing, she was fully rendered in the foreground, turned slightly away from the viewer, her face visible only in 3/4 profile. In another, she was barely suggested a figure in the distance, face reduced to a few essential marks that nonetheless communicated, unmistakably, the same person. Janelle set the portfolio down. She went to her desk and sat with it for a moment. Then she picked it up again and looked at the 7 drawings with the specific attention she gave to work that was asking her something she didn't yet understand. The woman in the drawings had high cheekbones. She had a slight tilt of the head to the left, consistently, across all 7 drawings, as if this were a characteristic gesture rather than a compositional choice. She had something in her eyes that Janelle, who had spent years learning to look at how students rendered emotion in faces, could only describe as known. Not famous known or public known. Known in the intimate, private sense. Drawn the way you draw something that matters in a way you cannot explain. She had seen students draw from imagination, and she had seen students draw from reference, and she had seen students draw from memory. This was memory, old enough and deep enough memory that it expressed itself consistently across 7 separate compositions, without the subject ever being named or framed directly. The girl was not drawing this woman consciously. She was drawing her the way people hum tunes they don't know they remember. Janelle held the portfolio closed in her lap for the rest of that afternoon, and through the evening, thinking, she taught 2 more classes. She drove home. She made dinner. She thought about it. She was not a detective. She was not a counselor or a social worker or any of the trained in crisis professionals whose job it would be to handle what she was beginning to suspect. She was an art teacher who had noticed something in a portfolio and did not know what to do with it, but felt, with increasing certainty, that she needed to do something. She went back on Tuesday and asked Destiny to stay after class. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. Janelle asked gently, without alarm, who the woman in the drawings was. Destiny went very still, the specific stillness of a person who has been asked a question they have been carrying for a long time without knowing they were carrying it. Then she said, "I don't know her name. I just remember her face." Janelle asked how she remembered it. "From when I was little," Destiny said. Before what?" Janelle asked. Before we came to live with my grandmother. Janelle said, "How old were you then?" Destiny said, "I think I was 6. Janelle thanked her. She told her she could go. She sat at her desk for a long time after the girl left. Then she went to see the school counselor. What followed moved faster than 15 years of official searching had ever moved. The school counselor contacted the Greenville County Department of Social Services on Wednesday morning. A caseworker requested the girl's enrollment records and cross-referenced the surname with missing persons databases. The match came back within 48 hours. Vivian Bowen had been listed as a person of interest in a family abduction case from October 2009, Columbia, South Carolina. The girls she had enrolled in Greenville County schools under her surname were the same girls. The address was on file in the enrollment records. Vivian Bowen had been living in a house on the east side of Greenville since 2011, 2 years after Cheryl Dawson had told Renata the upstate area. A lead that had been real and had pointed in the right direction and had arrived without enough specificity to find the specific house on the specific street. 15 years. 50 miles from where Renata lived. The girls had been 50 miles away. The Department of Social Services arrived at the house on March 28, 2024. Vivienne was home. She was 71 years old, and her health had declined substantially in the previous few years. She did not deny what had happened when the caseworkers arrived. She had been prepared for this, not with a plan, not with a defense, but with the settled quality of a woman who has been living for 15 years inside a decision she believed was right and who has long since stopped expecting to be able to explain that rightness to anyone outside herself. She answered their questions. She said, "I thought they were better off." She said, "I thought I was doing what was right for them." She said it without apology and without evasion, which made it more devastating rather than less. Renata Bowen received the call on the morning of April 2nd, 2024, in a hallway beside the nurses' station at her medical center in Rock Hill. She pressed her hand flat against the painted cinder block wall and listened. The DSS worker on the other end was careful and thorough and spoke with the measured cadence of someone who understood the weight of what they were conveying, that the daughters had been found, that they were alive and well, that they were in Greenville, that they had been told and were waiting. Renata said, "I need a minute." She had taken this particular minute many times across 15 years in the parking lots and waiting rooms and phone calls that made up the search's infrastructure, in the hospital hallways when a patient's status required recalibration before she could act. She had learned to take it efficiently. Enter the information, let it land, come back out of it ready. She took the minute. Then she said, "Can I come today?" The worker said, "Yes. They know you're coming." She told her charge nurse she needed to leave and why. The charge nurse, a woman who had worked beside Renata for 4 years and understood the shape of what she carried without having been told the specifics, said go. Just go. She drove south on I-77, the same highway she had driven south 15 years ago, dropping her daughters for what was supposed to be a weekend. She drove it in the opposite direction now, toward them, with both hands on the wheel and the radio off and the Carolina landscape greening around her in April. The familiar exits went past. She let herself, for the first time in 15 years, think about what she was driving toward rather than what she was not yet finding. She arrived in Greenville at 2:43 p.m. She sat in the DSS parking lot for 7 minutes. Then she got out of the car and went inside. Simone was 24 years old. Destiny was 21. The address where they had been living, a house on the east side of Greenville that Vivienne had occupied since 2011, had never been connected to any active investigation because no active investigation had been looking for it. The family abduction case from Columbia had produced no new leads in 13 years and was dormant in everything but its official status. The girls had been enrolled in Greenville County schools under Vivienne's surname. They had been, from the outside, her daughters. From the inside, they had been told a story. Introduced gradually, in the way revised histories are introduced to children who are old enough to remember something different, not as a single lie, but as an accumulation of details and implications in the gaps left by questions that never get answered, that eventually form a shape the child fills in with the available explanation. They had been told that their mother had made an arrangement, that she had been struggling, that the move to Greenville had been agreed upon. The story shifted slightly in its details across the years, as stories do when they are maintained by someone who built them to manage a situation rather than to survive scrutiny. But the core of it held, Renata had chosen not to keep them. The weekend visit had been the beginning of something more permanent, and their mother had known this when she said goodbye at the door. Simone had believed this with the reluctance of a child who has real memories and is being told those memories led somewhere they didn't. She had been 9. She had remembered too much. The story had required her to hold her own memories at a distance from what she was being told they meant. And this distance had a cost that accumulated over 15 years in ways she was still working out. Destiny had been 6. The memories she had were softer impressions rather than specifics, feelings attached to images that arrived without context. She had not remembered her mother's name. What she had retained was something that language could not reach, and that her drawing kept reaching for anyway. They were in the building. They had been told the truth. They were waiting. Renata got out of the car. The meeting that happened in a DSIS office in Greenville on the afternoon of April 2nd, 2024, was not the meeting of a movie. There was no slow-motion entrance, no swelling music, no single dramatic gesture that contained all 15 years at once. There was a waiting room and a hallway and a door, and on one side of the door was a 46-year-old woman who had last seen her daughters when they were 9 and 6, and on the other side of the door were a 24-year-old woman and a 21-year-old woman who had been told for 15 years that the person on the other side of the door had chosen not to be in their lives. The DSS caseworker had prepared them as best she could. She had told them what there was to tell, that their mother had been looking for them since the day they disappeared, that she had never stopped, that she had driven across the upstate for years, following a lead that was real, and had simply been too imprecise to find this specific house. She had told them that what they had been told about why they came to live with their grandmother was not accurate. She had used careful language, because this was the kind of information that needed careful language, that needed to arrive in a way that left room for the person receiving it to process it at their own pace. Simone had been 24 years old and had been believing for 15 years that her mother had given her up. She had the memories from before the apartment on Eastway Drive, the smell of the coffee her mother made on Sunday mornings, the specific sound of Renata's footsteps in the hallway at night when she came home from the overnight shift and checked on them before she slept. She had these memories, and she had also had, sitting beside them for 15 years, the narrative that those memories were the prelude to a choice her mother had made. Working out what the memories meant when the narrative was removed was not a quick process. It did not happen in a waiting room in a DSS office on an April afternoon. It would take months and then years, and would perhaps never fully arrive at a point where it felt settled, because some things do not settle. They become part of the foundation that everything else is built on, changed in their meaning, but not in their presence. When she looked at her mother's face across the DSS table on April 2nd, she looked at it with the specific attention of someone mapping a face against a memory and finding the distance between them larger than they expected and smaller than they feared. The face was familiar in ways she had suppressed for years: the high cheekbones, the slight tilt of the head, the quality in the eyes that meant she was paying attention to you. Simone had been paying attention to this face since she was 9 years old, when she still had the language for it, and she had continued paying attention to it across 15 years in the form of a grief that had no object she was permitted to name. She sat across from her mother and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, I remembered your voice. I forgot what you looked like, but I remembered your voice. Destiny had been 6. She did not have Simone's density of pre-disappearance memory. What she had was the face in the drawings, the face she had been putting on paper for 15 years, without knowing whose it was. Returning to it the way you return to a song you half remember, reaching for it without being able to name it. When the caseworker told her what her mother's name was, she sat with the name for a moment. Then she asked the caseworker to say it again. Renata, the name meant something and also felt new, which was the specific strangeness of the day. Renata walked through the door. Simone looked at her mother's face and said nothing for a long time. The face was familiar and also changed, the way faces are changed by 15 years and the particular weight of what those 15 years had held. Then she said, I remembered your voice. I forgot what you looked like, but I remembered your voice. Renata said, I know. I'm sorry it took so long. Simone said, it wasn't yours to apologize for. Destiny sat across from her mother and looked at the face she had been drawing for 15 years. She had drawn it in crowds and rooms and at a distance and up close and always with a slight tilt to the left, the high cheekbones, the quality in the eyes that her teacher had recognized as known. She had drawn it without knowing she was drawing it towards something. Now she looked at the original of what she had been drawing, and it was the same face, and it was also different in the way that anything is different when it goes from memory to presence, when the thing you have been reaching for is suddenly in the room. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said to Renata, I didn't know it was you. I just kept drawing you. Renata said, I know. She said, I know. Vivienne Bowen was charged with custodial interference and child abduction. She was 71 years old and her health had declined significantly, and the legal proceedings moved with the careful slowness that the law applies when the accused is elderly and the children are adults, and the damage was done 15 years ago, and the question before the court is how to account for 15 years of harm that no sentence can undo. Renata did not attend the proceedings. She had 15 years of conversations to begin. Janelle Okafor, when DSS contacted the school to confirm the enrollment records, gave her statement in a conference room with the principal and a social worker present. She described what she had seen in the portfolio and what she had asked and what the student had said. She was steady about it in the way that people are steady about things they have decided to do and have done correctly. She said, I saw something I didn't have a name for. I asked about it because I thought it mattered. I didn't know it would matter the way it did. The school counselor, in the same meeting, confirmed the sequence, Janelle's observation, the conversation with Destiny, the counselor's call to DSS. The counselor said, the teacher noticed something I would not have known to look for. The teacher said, I was looking at a student's work the way you look at a student's work when you're paying attention. Neither of them said anything else that was necessary because nothing else was necessary. Paying attention was the whole thing. It always had been. Simone and Destiny are navigating, together and separately, and in the gradual work of family that is also entirely new. What 15 years of a different story does to the architecture of who you believe yourself to be. Simone sees a therapist in Greenville once a week. She and Renata talk on the phone several times a week. And in those calls, they cover the territory of the years, not in order, not systematically, but the way you cover familiar ground when you have just been given access to it, circling back, covering the same material from different angles, finding new weight in old details. Destiny has transferred to a visual arts program at a community college in Columbia, an hour south of where her mother lives. She drives up twice a month. She is drawing differently than she was before April, more directly, more intentionally, with subjects she names rather than faces that arrive unnamed. She is finding out what it is like to make work from memory when the memory has a name. Janelle Okafor submitted her resignation from the school at the end of the 2024 academic year. She had been accepted to a graduate program in art therapy, a direction she had been considering for 2 years before that Tuesday afternoon, before the 8-minute conversation, before everything that followed it. She said, in the one interview she agreed to give, that she had been going back and forth on the application, that after April, she stopped going back and forth. Renata Bowen is 46 years old. She was 31 when she waved from the driveway of her mother's house in Colombia on a Friday afternoon in October 2009. She is 46 now, and the 15 years between those two numbers are visible in the specific way that 15 years of carrying an open question are visible not as age exactly, but as a quality of presence, a way of being in a room that suggests nothing in it will be taken for granted, that everything available is being registered and appreciated and not assumed to be permanent. She makes coffee on Sunday mornings. She sits at the kitchen table. She reads 3 pages of whatever novel she is working through before the day begins. This habit began as the one piece of peace she allowed herself in the years when peace was hard to find, and it has remained because it is still the right way to begin a Sunday. Some routines survive what they were built around and become something else, not a reminder of what was missing, but a practice in its own right, belonging to the present rather than the past. On most Sundays now, Destiny comes. She drives up from Columbia in the early afternoon, and they sit at the kitchen table, sometimes talking, sometimes Destiny drawing and Renata reading, sometimes just having coffee. They are learning the specific language available to them now, which is different from what it would have been without the 15 years, and which is also, in ways neither of them expected, fuller for what it has passed through. They are building it Sunday by Sunday, the way people build things when they have been given time that was almost taken from them entirely. Simone is in Greenville, in therapy once a week, working through the architecture of a 15-year story that was built wrong and needs to be rebuilt. She and Renata talk on the phone several times a week. The conversations do not follow a script. They circle and return and find new weight in old details, the memories from before, that now mean something different than they were made to mean. The years in the middle that happened to both of them in separate places for the same reason. The question of what the years ahead hold that neither of them can answer except by continuing to be present for them. Janelle Okafor is in a graduate art therapy program. She is 30 years old and learning to do formally what she had been doing intuitively, using creative work to reach the places that language cannot access directly. She said, in the one interview she agreed to give, that she had not done anything she would call exceptional. She had looked at work that was asking her something. She had asked a question. What happened after was the result of paying attention, which was what she had signed up to do. The interviewer asked whether she thought about Destiny's portfolio still. She said, I think about it every time I look at a student's work. I think about what they're saying that they can't say directly. I think about how much I might not be hearing. That thought keeps me paying attention. It always will. Vivienne Bowen is 71 years old and in poor health and facing legal proceedings that will move through the courts at their own pace, producing whatever outcome the law produces when the damage is 15 years old and the children are adults and the accounting has to find a form for something that no sentence can fully correct. Renata has not been asked to comment on this and has not commented. She has 15 years of a different accounting to attend to. She is spending her energy there. Some records are kept in databases. Some are kept on websites that a mother has been maintaining since 2010, updated year after year with new information and new age progression images and the same phone number, waiting for the right person to find it. Some are kept in the body, in the part that draws what it remembers when words are not available, in the face that returns to the page across 15 years, because some things do not go all the way away. They only wait for someone to recognize what they mean. The year Simone would have turned 18. Renata spent the August long weekend driving the upstate region again, not because she had a new lead, but because she could not spend that particular August weekend in her apartment. She drove through Greenville. She drove through Spartanburg. She passed through neighborhoods she had driven through before, looking at faces on sidewalks and in parking lots, and through restaurant windows with the automatic and exhausting attention of someone whose eyes have been recalibrated to look for two specific faces in a world full of faces that are not them. She did not find them. She drove home on Sunday night and went back to work on Monday morning. She had been doing this for 9 years. She would do it for 6 more. What she did not know, driving through Greenville on that August weekend in 2018, was that Destiny was 4 miles away in a house on the east side of the city, at the kitchen table with a sketchbook, drawing the face that kept coming back. Destiny was 15 years old. She had been drawing this face since she was old enough to hold a pencil, with intention, and she would continue drawing it for 6 more years, in sketchbooks and on the margins of notebooks, and eventually in the portfolio that would make its way into a teacher's hands on a March afternoon in 2024. The face kept coming back because some things do not go all the way away. The face was 4 miles from where Renata was driving. 4 miles. 6 years. Destiny Bowen drew her mother's face 7 times in a single school year without knowing that was what she was drawing. She drew it in crowds and corners and the backgrounds of compositions that were officially about other things. She drew it because something in her that language could not reach kept returning to it, kept insisting on it, kept making the marks that added up across a school year to an unmistakable record of what she could not say. An art teacher paid attention. A student had been saying it all along. That is how this came to light. Not through a database, or a tip line, or a detective with new information. Through a charcoal drawing in a portfolio, and a teacher who looked at it the way she looked at everything the way you look when you have decided that paying attention is not something you do when it is convenient, but what you do. The way you look when you understand that some truths travel in pencil and charcoal, and the slow, quiet work of a child who does not know she is keeping a record, only that the face keeps coming back, only that the face has always mattered in a way she cannot explain, only that something in her that language cannot reach keeps returning to the same marks on the same paper across the same years. Making the same face, waiting, Renata Bowen was 31 years old on a Sunday morning in October 2009, sitting at her kitchen table with her coffee and her novel. She was not worried. There was no reason to worry. Her daughters were at their grandmother's house, 2 hours south, and she was picking them up Monday morning, and everything was fine. Everything was not fine, and it would not be fine again, in any complete sense, for 15 years. But 15 years later, she is at the kitchen table again, coffee in hand, 3 pages of a novel, the Sunday morning exactly as she built it in the years when it was the only piece of the week that belonged entirely to her. And on most Sundays, her daughter comes, sits across from her, sometimes draws, sometimes just has coffee. They are fine, in the specific and earned way that fine means more than it used to, not the fine of things being easy or uncomplicated or free of the weight of what happened, but the fine of 2 people who were separated by something they did not choose, and who have found their way back to the same table and are choosing every Sunday to be there. That is how it ended, and that is where it begins.